It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Alan Speight to St. John's College tonight. Professor Speight is an alum of the Annapolis campus and is currently a professor of philosophy at Boston University. He's won numerous awards, including teaching awards and a Fulbright grant to study German, as well as a Fulbright professorship in Germany. He has published numerous articles and books on authors such as Hegel, Goethe, and Hölderlin, and on a wide range of topics, including the intersection of art, religion, and philosophy. Dr. Speight's lecture is entitled The Philosophical Challenge of Early Art. Please join me in welcoming him to St. John's.
Thank you very much, Dean Pullman. It's great to be here. Before I begin tonight, I want to say a couple of words of both gratitude and devotion and dedication. Like many of you, I have felt in these last days the loss of our beloved Miss Bran. I had the good fortune to have her as my freshman language tutor, and I can't imagine having had any better introduction to the life of the mind, not just for opening up how the learning of Greek mattered, but also for the moments of sheer excitement in her eyes or the warm smile of approval when there was a discovery in class. She also realized, above all, that the gifts of liberal learning were not for an exclusive few. I still remember when she and I were involved some decades ago in trying to set up a national association of programs devoted to core texts, one that came to include both St. John's and the core program at Boston University, among many others, a program that's now headed by my terrific classmate, Josh Perrins. From that endeavor, I learned a lot about EVA's advocacy for inclusion and incorporation, for opening a broad tent to those who could join together in a common educational cause. There are few who possess both the intellectual and ethical virtues together, as she did, and for all these reasons, we'll miss her and continue to treasure the legacy she's given us. I also want to say, and on behalf of my friend Robert Christian, a personal word of dedication tonight to our former classmate, John Rittner, whom we lost a few years ago. I never got to talk with John about this project, but he had a large and encompassing interest in the connections between philosophy and the arts and sciences, so I hope some of that resonance will be present tonight. So, the philosophical challenge of early art. In the summer of 2018, I took my family across the Atlantic with the goal of seeing some artwork firsthand. The artwork I was interested in was some of the earliest ever created by human beings. Art not to be found on the white rectilinear walls of museums, but underground on the sinuous walls of ancient caves. I had read about the origins of Paleolithic rock art, which is stunningly preserved across several hundred caves in southern France and northern Spain, on both sides of the Pyrenees Mountains, and in a number of other sites across the world, from South Africa to Indonesia. I found myself in the position of not knowing what to think about the art from pictures and accounts I'd seen, where to place it aesthetically, or how to make sense of it as a moment in the development of human culture. You may have similar questions as those I had then and have continued to have. How should we think about a painting that's 30,000 years old? What makes such a painting art, if it is? What prompted our early ancestors to create the particular figures that they did on these cave walls? This evening, I want to invite you to explore with me the phenomena of Paleolithic cave art and the philosophical questions it raises. I will be interested in what you think, especially if you are seeing some of the images I will show tonight for the first time. In some ways, I think early art can be a kind of Rorschach test for us. It lets us learn something about our expectations for what art is, for how we receive it. What is it that we see? And as we attend phenomenologically to that experience, how should we see it? Our responses to early art are immediate and often visceral, but we are also aware of the vast difference between what we take to be art and what we can understand of the origins of the artifacts of an earlier age. The distance between the immediacy of our contemporary reaction and the context in which such artifacts are produced is, of course, a factor in any encounter with art. But in the case of early art, the difficulty is even more complicated. So if I ask you what you see on the screen, my guess is most of you will have a pretty declarative answer. That's a rhinoceros. There is much we do not know about the human being who drew this particular rhinoceros, or the context in which it was viewed by its initial spectators, but it's a remarkable fact to notice that at a 30,000-year remove, how instantaneously we recognize it. Yet even in just this slide, there is more to take in. You might notice that this image is flat, but appears to be bounded both in front and in back within a three-dimensional crevice in which it's drawn. That certain parts of the figure seem both to connect to and emphasize the outlines of that crevice. Notice how the longest horn of the rhinoceros goes deeply up into that crevice, or how its legs seem to bound over a hump, as if the rhinoceros is trying to spring out of that crevice. If we explore the wider imagery nearby in the cave where this is found, the remarkable Chauvet cave in southern France, we have some further questions. First, we would notice what one scholar has called the remarkable profusion of fauna on the walls. This is one of the most busy panels in Chauvet cave. And we notice, if we move more closely, these amazing horses, which some of you may have seen, these lions, and of course, more rhinoceroses. In fact, a fifth of the figures in Chauvet cave are rhinoceroses, the most of any cave that we know about. So while we experience the image's immediacy, there's something which draws us further into its wider connection with other images, and perhaps also the potential for strangeness and distance in that experience will impress us also. It's the exploration of the relation between those experiences of immediacy and difference that will interest me especially this evening. In what follows, I want to do three things. First of all, I want to give you a sense of the phenomena. Cave art remained hidden from human exploration until quite recently, fewer than 150 years ago, despite its being a surprisingly widespread phenomenon. Secondly, I want to explore with you the question of what cave art can tell us about the origins and nature of art. Are there assumptions we make about what art is that are challenged or at least clarified by early art? One of the assumptions that interests me especially is that art must be some kind of mimesis. I think that's a very interesting question to clarify with respect to early art. And in the final section, what larger conclusions we can draw about the role of the symbol and visual art for us as human beings, making sense of ourselves and the strange many thousand-year journey we human beings have been on as creators and appreciators of art. This is a particular question of interpretation and translation, how we may stand in front of a work of art that has both immediacy and yet deep strangeness for us. Specifically, of course, in this case, how we may thoughtfully engage a work that is not accompanied by language or embedded in a recoverable narrative. When we look at an ancient Greek vase, for example, we can explore the similarity of what's painted with scenes from Homer and Athenian tragedy, but we have no such narrative resources for the early art that we'll be looking at tonight. My own point of departure and the questions that have animated me are primarily philosophical. I came to be interested in these questions as I thought about another moment in which a philosopher I work on, namely Hegel, had tried to make sense of a sudden explosion of new information about the artistic and cultural world of the past. In the 1820s, as treasures from Egyptian and Persian civilizations were brought back to European capitals after English, French, and German expeditions, Hegel started to find the existing dual paradigm at the time of classical versus modern art insufficient. The interruption forced Hegel, who had a front row seat to all of this in the expansion of a new museum in Berlin directly across from his house, to include an additional category of art in his lectures on the history of art, the pre-classical or the symbolic, which he thought had a range of sublime and mysterious motifs that we can't find in the classical beauty of Greece, for example. The recent discoveries in the cave world, of course, utterly unknown to Hegel, have prompted me in a similar way to think about the nature and history of art and what new categories or approaches we might need to make best sense of it. On Hegel's view and mine, one thing you have to do as a philosopher in such circumstances is to get to know all you can about what archaeologists have learned and what questions have emerged from their finds. So I'll start first with an introduction, really an invitation to the archaeological world of cave art and what we know. So part one, Paleolithic cave art, the phenomena. In the modern era, the fascination with cave art begins with the discovery of the paintings in a cave in Altamira, Spain, the northern part of Spain, in 1879. The landowner Marcelino de Saltolo credited his 8-year-old daughter with seeing the paintings first. And he made a case for authenticity that was a very difficult case to make. Many vehemently denied when the discoveries were first announced. It might have seemed more credible if the series of findings from his caves became sequentially more intricate, but these were the first examples of Paleolithic cave art that were ever known by humans. This wonderful bull. There is a ceiling of bulls in Altamira, jutting out from the ceiling on these bosses that convey the magnitude of their bodies. So first find Altamira. The second, perhaps, there are many in between, but the second most famous discovery near a place called Lascaux, again discovered by kids, in this case 2 boys on a hunting expedition in occupied France in 1940. The Lascaux cave became so popular that its walls were endangered. A sort of fungus started growing on the walls, endangering the art, and the cave was closed. But 2 replicas were built, one very early and the other quite recently, that includes a lot of virtual technology. And of course, the discovery at Chauvet, where the rhinoceros comes from, really quite recent, 1994. The age of art expanded with the discovery of Chauvet. Altamira and Lascaux take us perhaps to 19,000 years ago. Chauvet moved that to 32,000 years ago, or perhaps even longer. Some of you perhaps know about the director Werner Herzog's fascination with the Chauvet discoveries, which turned into the remarkable film Cave of Forgotten Dreams. In some ways, a cinematographer's attempt to see the beginnings of his own art in the experience of flickering shadows on a cave wall. Herzog's film is only one part of the contemporary access we have to the caves. Both Altamira and Lascaux were closed and replicas were built. There's a very exacting replica now at Herzog's Chauvet, and the one cave that has involved a watery entrance, the Cosquet cave, now has a remarkable replica in downtown Marseille. In addition to these replicas, however, there are real caves. Caves which are not replicating experience, but caves in which you can experience Paleolithic art in front of you. The first of these that I saw it's a cave very near Altamira, Las Monedas, one of a series of 3 caves up on Monte Castillo, named for the 16th century coins which were found inside. A little bit of a sense that discovery does not always mean that the cave hadn't been entered before we realized there was Paleolithic art there. I will say a little bit more about Las Monedas and its images later, as well as about the difference between seeing a replica and seeing a real cave. The Spanish and the French especially experience these caves as a cultural and family event. They come as family groups, they have lunch, they do some hiking, take the kids to dinosaur theme park attractions nearby. You know, it's hard not to have a sense of wonder as you listen to French school children's questions about what led human beings to create art. As we consider the phenomena of cave art, let me say a few words about what we know archaeologically and anthropologically about their origins, who made them, what's known about the conditions of their production. I'll do this with the questions who, when, where, what, and how. So who? Some of our earliest human ancestors, very much like us, 30 to 40,000 years ago, a lot like us physiologically anyway, perhaps stronger, taller, though under different pressures. Despite the distance in time, it used to be said that such art was the distinctive feature of Homo sapiens. But recent discoveries, some in one of those 3 caves on Monte Castillo, have suggested that Neanderthals were also an artistically creative species. Here are some authenticated, oops, oh dear. Let's try that again. There we go. Here are some Neanderthal drawings. Perhaps you will notice that these are non-figurative drawings. That's the case with most Neanderthal art. In fact, connected very much to the other kinds of decorative work that Neanderthals were doing, these shells are very, very old, 115 to 120,000 years ago, we think. It was assumed in a lot of the earlier scholarship on cave paintings that we were talking primarily about male artists, but there is significant evidence that women and adolescents, as well as children, were among the artists. What's striking in some of these cases is that the children didn't participate in cave painting just accidentally, but were intentionally held up to high places in caves so that they could make handprints or trace finger flutings. There is evidence even of very small children participating. In the cave at Gargave, France, a baby's hand was actually held up to the rock to make imprints. The Paleolithic family that painted together stayed together, apparently. So who? Our early Homo sapiens and some Neanderthals. When? The primary period that interests us for cave art is the Upper Paleolithic, so beginning about 40,000 years ago. This is a hunter-gatherer society in contrast with the following period of the Neolithic, which was a lot more agricultural. This was a period of new migration into Europe. Our earliest ancestors arrived in Europe out of Africa during this period, finding that the Neanderthals were still there, as well as a number of strange animals that are now extinct. The cave bear, the woolly mammoth, the oryx with its fascinating bull-like horns. It was a period in which climate and environmental change was an important part of what our ancestors had to cope with. The Ice Age actually meant remarkable shifts back and forth in relatively short periods of time, in some cases from forest to steppes within 140 years or so, an experience that's worth keeping in mind in terms of our own concerns about climate change. How did our ancestors cope? Neanderthals apparently grew wider noses and thicker frames, but the decisive thing for human survival may have been the sewing needle and the ability to make clothes to survive during the new kind of winter cold. These are bone sewing needles from the Gourdon cave in France. One question you may have is how we know that early cave art dates to this very distant period, or even as some of the first scholars to encounter it claimed, how we know it's not just a fake. As I mentioned, the early debates about authenticity were quite fierce. Some of the earliest finds were heavily challenged in terms of their authenticity, and there were a number of problems in dating. It's really only been since the 1990s that accurate dating has been possible. Radiocarbon dating, first in an indirect way, charcoal that may have been used, but then accelerator mass spectrometry to date the paint directly. Since radiocarbon dating is unreliable after 40,000 years or so, the Neanderthal discoveries relied on analysis of flowstones, the milky crusts of minerals and walls that contain tiny amounts of uranium, which slowly breaks down into thorium. But before I leave the when question, it's worth saying that while these new discoveries have pushed back our sense of the earliest known dates of art's origin, it's perhaps equally remarkable that this tradition of art continued for as much as 20 to 25,000 years, which makes it not just the oldest, but the longest lasting human visual tradition that we know. I'll say more about that in a later section. Who, when, and where? There is rock art on every continent, but probably the greatest density of explored caves lies in the region of the Pyrenees, in northern Spain and the central Rhone Valley in southwest France, in more than 360 Upper Paleolithic sites with artistic decoration in these areas. Researchers are starting to look at the finds as well in other areas. Africa has mostly exterior rock art, but one of the more interesting and now the very oldest cave art sites from the dating, extending just a bit, the date of Chauvet, has been discovered to be in Sulawesi, Indonesia. This is a remarkable piece of art for several reasons, because it involves, it seems, something that is very rarely found in the European cave art examples, something narrative, right? If those are indeed human beings that are taking a shot at their prey. Who, what, where, who, when, where, what. The cave art we have is primarily animal figures and abstract symbols. In terms of percentage of figures, there are more abstract symbols, but the animal figures dominate the wall space. And this is the great introduction to Paleolithic fauna that we've mentioned. And here you see the counts of these figures: bison, horse, woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros. Studies across the cave art of Europe have noticed interesting statistics. I think you can see just from this tabulation, the two most frequently seen are horse and bison. I'll say more about that in just a moment. One question you may have as you look at this list, horse, bison, ibex, where are the human beings? You see here hardly 4% of the paintings on cave walls represent human beings in any way. Why is this? A question I think we want to return to. Even when human beings are represented, they are treated in a fairly stylized way, with their features often just blending with those of animal figures, so-called therianthropes. This is the one human representation in Chauvet, a pelvis with an animal head on top. Very perplexing figure. So that we are not entirely anthropomorphic about this, it should be said that we as human beings are not the only figures left out of cave art in this period. There is even less representation of other members of the animal kingdom that our early ancestors knew about. Only a few fish are represented. There are virtually no reptiles or insects. This is one of the birds. It's not a penguin, it's a great auk that's in that water-bound cave I mentioned, Casquet. There is almost, those of you who love landscape painting, there's no landscape or vegetation representation. It would be hard to look at the cave paintings and say that their goal was to, let us say, represent the general living environment of Paleolithic humans. So one key question we're left with is why the focus on particular animals? The century of scholarship following Altamira's discovery turned on several theoretical approaches that were found insufficient, but I think that each got at something that we might think, right? The first of the approaches followed up on the possibility that the animals on the walls must have been there as part of some ritual associated with hunting magic, making sure the hunt went well. Cave art not as a luxury or the result of play, but as part of a larger set of religious or quasi-religious rituals connected with evolutionary success. This makes sense of the constant repetition of animal imagery and seems convincing for a while, but it came up against some very crucial empirical difficulties. For one thing, it turns out that the animal bones in these caves that have been found as food refuse have not turned out to be those of the range of animals that have been painted most in the actual caves. Delicious reindeer or ibex, not as much, for example, as numerous mammoths, horses, or bison. So if it's not a kind of hunting ritual, what might it be? Especially in the middle years of the 20th century, the structuralists followed up on apparent binaries within cave art. I mentioned horse and bison are the two competing top groups of animals. And structuralist analysts began to work out that opposition. Right? Perhaps one is male, perhaps one is female, although there was difference among them about which was which. Do you think horse is male or bison female? Very interesting question among the structuralists. Also of interest is the relation between dangerous animals that tended to be at the bottom of caves and what we might call delicious animals closer to the top. Finally, there is a more abstract side of cave painting as well, in addition to these animal representations. These memorable red fist dots in Chauvet, geometric markings like this, and then what's called finger fluting, just scraping one's fingers along what's called mundmilk or moonmilk, the soft white creamy substance as a precipitate from limestone that's on cave walls. Also, in addition to cave art painted or engraved into the rock surface itself, there are also small portable objects, what the French call art mobilier, and work that falls between those two types. Interestingly, there is a little more human figuration in these smaller carved pieces, including my very favorite, the so-called Madame de Brassampouy. Very enigmatic figure, isn't she? And how? How did they create this art? In the deep caves, art is primarily a matter of painting, whereas engraving is what you find on the outside rocks or in rock shelters. The painting media are charcoal and ochre pigment, a substance that turns out to be very important to the origins of human making and self-adornment. Self-adornment turns out to be a very, very early practice indeed. There are pigments of ochre in deposits in South Africa that date to 160,000 years ago, for example. Two final things to keep in mind as you think about how these pictures were made. One is that the application of pigment is sometimes a very intimate process. A kind of expectoration was used in some cases. You would hold the pigment in your mouth and then guide its application to the rock surface in a very smooth way like this. I'll talk in the next section about the difference between the tactile and expressive elements of this process in contrast with later modes of painting. Secondly, the relation between light and dark. This is what fascinates a filmmaker like Herzog so much. The artist's work was lit probably with small lamps fueled by animal fat. This obviously puts a time constraint on how long you could remain in the dark, but it also emphasizes something that I think we have to notice: the great commitment on the part of the early artists to stay in the dark and work. With that sense of the phenomena of Paleolithic cave art in mind, I want next to step back from our experience to ask about how we might think about it. The claim I want to make is that it raises philosophical questions about art and our experience of it that cut across many assumptions that we likely make. And again, the mimetic question is going to be one of the ones that I think most about here. So what can cave art tell us about the origins and nature of art? Before I go further, let me just say a word about how I'm using the word art in what follows. Anthropologists and archaeologists tend to use a stripped-down artifactual notion of art to connote an archaeological category of material, objects like figurines, paintings, irrespective of their aesthetic interest. But this very embracing notion of art toggles back and forth with a richer notion, high art, let us say, the art that we have in mind when we view art at museums and talk about it, art created with the intention of being a part of an art world. For present purposes, I'll be using the first and more open term, although it will be, I think, unavoidable to return to the second and more exclusive one. We are naturally attracted, just looking at these slides, to the pictorial and illustrative qualities of ancient cave art. Perhaps it's natural to think about this in terms of an early impulse to imitate what one sees in the world, to construe it, in other words, along the lines of a mimetic theory of art. Many of our assumptions about the origin of art are indeed mimetic. This is true in our own day, and as you know, is certainly true about historical attempts to give an account of art. There are a number of very famous images of mimesis, which you know. In the Critique of Imitation in Book 10 of the Republic, for example, Plato has Socrates link the craftsmanship of imitative artists to the image of a mirror which can copy or reproduce all things around it, and so must have a similar kind of craftsmanship. It's a sort of craftsmanship, Socrates says, that is widely available and quickest of all, I suppose, if you're willing to take a mirror, turn it around in all directions. That way, you will quickly make the sun and the things in the sky. You will quickly make the earth, yourself, and other animals, manufactured items, plants, and everything else that was mentioned just now. From the ancient world, there is also the evidently Platonically inspired account in the Roman author and natural philosopher Pliny, who says that while the geographical origin of painting is uncertain, yet all agree that it began with tracing an outline around a man's shadow, and consequently that pictures were originally done in this way. Pliny has, in fact, a kind of an interesting embroidered story about how this came to be. He tells the story of a potter named Butates from the town of Corinth, whose daughter had a boyfriend who was going away. She'd miss him, of course, so what she did was trace his outline before he left. This became a very interesting theme for painters at the time of silhouette painting, the late 18th century. You see here a version of the French painter Chauvet of this origin story that Pliny tells about tracing as the origin of art. An interesting story for art theory as well Pliny's account through Quintilian finds its way also into Renaissance discourses on art in Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci, for example. Alberti's notion of a glass through which objects are seen is important both for the notion of perspective and the idea of seeing the world in a frame as central to painting. The origin story about art as a kind of mirroring or tracing is, I think, at odds with a number of things going on in Paleolithic cave art. No one thinks that wall paintings came from drawing a silhouette, as if Paleolithic hunter-gatherers could have dragged the animals they represent into the caves to get them just right. Still, there's something about the account that Pliny gives that has some connections for early cave art and our attempt to think through whether art's origins are as mimetic as someone like Pliny might make us believe. There's clearly an interaction of shadow and walls, the physicality and tracing, the element of dimensionality. So it would be strange to say that mimetic naturalism is not at work in early cave painting, but there are also many elements to notice that raise questions about understanding early cave art in terms that are limited by focusing on art construed only on a notion of mimesis. Let's look at one of the great painted images from the caves. These are the famous spotted horses panel in the cave of Peshmerel. And just to locate this for you, this is about 320 kilometers east of Chauvet, so we might expect perhaps somewhat different regional traditions here, although there are clearly some commonalities. The spotted horses, this is the entrance to Peshmerel Cave. The spotted horses give us an interesting example of how the imitation view of art might be limited. There was a lot of excitement a few years ago after a study of DNA. This New York Times article followed a study originally published in Science that analyzed the DNA and fossilized bones of wild horses from the late Pleistocene that had roamed Siberia, East and Central Europe, and the Iberian Peninsula to see if there was evidence that spotted horses could indeed have roamed during the period this painting was made. And the DNA did suggest that such coat color might have been present. The Times quoted one of the archaeologists who collaborated in the study, Terry O'Connor from the University of York, as drawing what seemed to be an obvious conclusion. People drew spotted horses because they saw spotted horses. In fact, O'Connor took the point further. Our research removes the need for any symbolic explanation of the horses. People drew what they saw, and that gives us great confidence in understanding Paleolithic depictions of other species as naturalistic illustrations. But perhaps not so fast. Facts about this painting make this a much more complicated story. First of all, the DNA turns out to have been from animals gathered much later, probably 14,000 years ago, whereas the spotted horses painting has been dated to around 26,000 years ago. So not to say that spotted horses weren't present, but certainly not dispositive proof. More problematically, let's look back at this painting. Notice where the spots are. Yes, there are spots on the hides, but notice what's going on with the spots in the composition as a whole. They're functionally larger compositional elements that seem to move beyond a merely mimetic interest, 212 black dots that swirl around the horses, and just for good measure, a couple dozen red dots thrown in as well. Barbara Olens-Alpert, who was an art historian at Brown, made just this point a couple of years after the New York Times article, as she argued for the larger compositional and non-mimetic role they play in the panel. And here we have to recognize that there are a number of possible aesthetic effects that aren't merely mimetic. Alpert suggested we think especially, for example, about the interaction of torchlight and splattered surfaces like this, like mosaics lit by candles. There may have been an awe-inducing effect to the composition as a whole. In fact, there are a number of features in this panel that are important to explore. A painstaking study of it and its place in the cave as a whole in the context of its region was recently done by Michel de Larbonché, one of the most prominent French specialists in the field, former director of research at the French National Center for Scientific Research. I won't follow the entire detail of his analysis, but I do want to talk about three of these elements that have been interesting to contemporary researchers and what they might reveal about the origins of cave art, how it's rendered, and what else is going on. So first question, let's start with a question you might have. What leads Paleolithic artists to place the paintings where they are? And let me ask you to look at that right horse's head again. It's perhaps hard to see on this slide, but it's painted on a natural outcropping of rock. You can see the dark outline of that. That's a natural outcropping, and the painter has come along and painted this horse's head. The connection between natural features of cave topography, like the rock outcropping and the painting of a head, has been explored in terms of an experience that's called pareidolia. You get the Greek, yes? The psychological phenomenon, as these researchers say, of seeing meaningful forms in random patterns, pareidolia. This is something all of us have experience of if you've sat back and looked at the figures in clouds in the sky, seen faces, other objects. Even when those are only hints of larger pictures, we can construct a complete picture despite missing visual information. This ability has, in addition to its aesthetic interest for us, the researchers say, some important evolutionary bases. Our visual system, for example, might want to be able to alert us to even the partial possibility of a potential predator. It has both, obviously, visual and emotional import for us. A recent study by 3 researchers looked at Las Monedas, another of the caves I mentioned in Monte Castilla, and discovered that in Las Monedas, almost 3/4 of the images expressed a strong relationship to the topography of the cave wall. And their research focuses especially on these kinds of examples of pareidolia. The first is just the dotted line there is a rock fissure. So the first, very much like the spotted horses in Peshmerga, just incorporates that into the design. The horse just makes the back of that horse is exactly the existing fissure in the rock wall. Second, it might be in parallel. So here's the rock fissure, here's the dorsal line of the horse. Right? It might mimic it, but not parallel it. But of course, there is other art which doesn't do that at all. There are many such examples of cave art that do suggest pareidolia. I mentioned, of course, these terrific Altamira bison. Each of those bison is painted on an outcropping in the rock ceiling. So the convexity of the bull is something that is contrasted with the concavity that we associate with horses, and in the case of this figure, so-called Megaceros, this is from the cave in Cognac, really one of the most remarkable examples of pareidolia I can think about. This is a very large animal indeed, but you can see this underline of the Megaceros. You can almost get directly underneath that. So the rock outcropping really seems to be something that inspires the cave art and its place. The authors who have studied this phenomenon of pareidolia point out that previous representationalist or mimeticist approaches to Paleolithic art have tended to assume the artist was in control of the creation of their art. That is to say, they imposed a predetermined mental representation of the depiction onto a passive surface. The more passive experience of seeing an animal in the evocative features of cave walls may have acted as a kind of cognitive scaffolding, they think, allowing artists to conceive of and represent animals on a surface. There are important connections here to a number of ethnographic contexts, thinking about the cave wall as a sort of natural membrane that becomes part of a cultural experience. And here there are several points of comparison between the experience of the cave wall in Paleolithic art and various religious or cultural connections to material form that we know something about in the cultural formations of our present world. For example, Aboriginal Australian rock art, which practitioners believe allows ancestors to speak through the rock surface, Inuit figurines that allow the release of a trapped form, for example. So just to sum up this point, it's important to emphasize again that what's different from those earlier images of painting, it's not copying something, but a drawing of something out of the rock wall that's been only partially glimpsed. Right? The figure of the bulls, the figure of the Megaceros. So pareidolia is the first. The second feature I want to think about, one that we noticed in comparing the various kinds of animals that are represented on cave walls. Perhaps you have noticed this already, the dorsal line of the horse. Most animals tend to be drawn in profile. We're not viewing them head first or from below, but from a distance. Why is this? Lambros Maliferis, professor of cognitive and anthropological archaeology at Oxford, draws on a study of experiments by a group of researchers who asked participants to do two things. First, rate how typical figures are in a group of photographs, and then identify them as rapidly as possible. Very high correlation between these two things. Is this a typical picture of something? How quickly do you recognize it? The most successful view, it turns out, this is part of Malafuris's research, the most successful view is a view that, like the profile view, he calls it the canonicity, the canonical perspective, that allows for maximal recognition, and that turns out to be not from the back, right? Not from head on, right? But this dorsal line that we've seen. This is the perspective that allows us to recognize most quickly. As Malafuris puts it, this allows for an increasing perceptual awareness of perception. He suggests the notion, again, of art as a kind of scaffolding function. The principal role of early imagery, he says, in the context of human cognitive evolution, was to provide a scaffolding device that enabled human perception gradually to become aware of itself. So Paleolithic images, in his view, first bring forth a new process of acting within this world, and at the same time of thinking about it, we have to understand art as a new form of perceptual learning. These points about pareidolia and canonical representation suggest a different relation of artists to the world than copyistic imitation. They are remarkable on a couple of different planes. First, notice how different the relation of artist to material and product is from the mimetic tradition. We've mentioned, and in addition to the tracing picture, this is actually a 19th century imagination of what Paleolithic artists must have been. It makes them look quite a lot like easel painters. This was a part of a Pompidou Center recent exhibition on the myth of the prehistoric. As we've seen from thinking about the phenomenon of pareidolia, though, and from the direct expressive efforts it took sometimes to put pigment on the walls, these painters didn't have the sort of optical distance that the easel painter may have had from before the landscape that he's painting. The product is intimately connected to the material, three-dimensional space of the cave, not a separable product that's on an easel and that would be meant for a museum wall. Perhaps it's closer to some practical advice often given aspiring sculptors. Perhaps you've heard some version of this. It's attributed variously to Michelangelo, Ruskin, and Picasso, among others. How do you sculpt, say, a rhinoceros? Well, you just chip away at everything that's not rhinoceros. There might be a number of conceptions of artistic agency involved in this advice, but notice what's the same. It's not an imposition, but rather something in the material itself that the artist works out through a process of engagement with it. And once the artist steps back from that engagement to see what has been produced, its perceptual recognizability is key. For broader philosophical questions about cave art, thinking about representation in terms not of the impulse to copy but to draw out, as not an imposition of an internal concept but the perceptual working out of a problem, has important implications for how we think about art and symbolic representation. But can we explain all the elements of cave art in terms of optimizing perceptual recognition? This would suggest a consistent progressive move toward naturalism, but might there be culturally specific elements that require a different approach? In the horses panel, to go back for a second, there's one more element that I want to talk about, and that's the curious shape of the horse's head. You might have asked yourself, isn't that very sort of thin head, looks like a bit of a duckbill, perhaps? We can ask such questions about a number of the figures in Paleolithic art, for example, the so-called Chinese horses at Lascaux, and wonder whether this is a naturalistic representation or not. And here I want to draw on work of the great 20th century art historian E.H. Gombrich, who lived to write about the discoveries at Chauvet, and who was interested precisely in this question. Why in the history of art we have intensely figurative art that we immediately seem to recognize as naturalistic? On the one hand, this is his example on the left, works of classical age Greek sculptors, this statue of the famous Athena of Velitri, seen in this copy in Paris, with its gestures of openness and natural stance. In contrast, for Gombrich, with art that he found stylistic. For example, the figure on the right, this figure Hesi Ra in the Egyptian relief, somewhat stiff with the proportions, not quite what we would expect naturalistically. How to think about the difference between the naturalistic and the stylistic modes of art, the rich naturalism of the Greeks, the somewhat stiffer style of the Egyptians. Gombrich would say, of course, we could say it's all a matter of perception. And as a riposte, Gombrich loved this New Yorker cartoon, which makes it seem as though Right? You could have had an Egyptian class of life drawing ready to capture the stylized gestures we now all associate with Egyptian figures. But of course, that's a stretch for an argument. Gombrich claimed that the stylistic side of art evident in Egyptian painting and statuary was governed by what he called schemata, culturally specific imperatives like the need to represent important figures with certain size and stance, or easily identifiable iconic signs. Tracing style to its etymological roots in the Latin word stylus or pen, Gombrich argues that a style, like a culture or climate of opinion, sets up a horizon of expectation, a mental set. For Gombrich, the questions about that mental set in this case would be, can we comprehend a cultural need that drove the particular stylistic rendering of Paleolithic art? For example, what's the need that drove the apparent dualism between bison and horse? These are questions that don't have easy answers in terms of mimetic accuracy, but involve a longer story in terms of what we can know about the cultures in which particular art emerged. As I mentioned, this poses particularly vexing questions in terms of cave art, because unlike the ancient Egyptians, we don't have a written record which can give us context for the art, although we do have datable cultural remains of other sorts. Gombrich thought the naturalistic and stylistic sides of art converged ultimately historically, but he also thought there was something about the role of non-figurative elements, not just the spots themselves, but also the range of other non-figurative symbols that are arrayed around the horses in the panel, as well as the much wider range of non-figurative elements that we see across the caves. And this is a schema of some of the various non-figurative symbols that we see. There is much research on these figures at the moment. The Canadian paleoanthropologist Genevieve van Petzinger has isolated some 32 such symbols across various caves, and a number of scholars are exploring whether we might think of some of these markings also as, for example, seasonal records of mating pictures of mating periods of pictured animals. This is a recent study about whether such marks next to the animals might have meant something like that. But one question that remains underexplored, in my view, is the relation between figurative and non-figurative sides in terms of their functions together. So that's the question I want to take up in this last section, symbol and visuality, art, aura, and the presence of the absent. I want to begin this last section by moving within the cave of Peshmerel from the wall painting of the spotted horses, which stand in an area with lots of space for people to gather, almost like a gallery, to the top of the cavern itself. I mentioned the importance of the sort of work that Laure Blanchet and others have done, exhaustively noticing all the details of a particular cave, comparing it with others of similar geography and time frame. The spotted horses aren't just a one-off artistic item, but part of a set of moves made within and around the overall space of the cave. You remember the finger flutings. These seem like automatic finger tracings, macaroni. This is a schematic drawing. This is not a photograph, but a schematic drawing of one of these fluting panels in Peshmerel. And again, as you look at it, let's see what you notice within the fluting. Right? Again, it might just seem like random finger movements to you. But let me ask you to focus on one detail. This is a motif known as the female/bison. And now look at this again. This is a rendering to help us see a little bit the specific figures that are involved. I'm sorry, this is such a murky slide, right? But this femme bison, right, this sort of pregnant stomach, right? You're not quite sure whether it's a female form or an animal form. Again, this emerges from the macaroni. And here we have another interesting element of Paleolithic art that also poses questions for traditional copyistic mimetic accounts. This is what I'd call, if you think about the relation between the seemingly automatic finger tracings and what I hope you can now see as this motif that's present within the finger flutings. something I'd call maybe a kind of symbolic generativity or creativity, which links both the figurative and the non-figurative sides of the art we've seen. What's the relation between what could seem to be random finger flutings and the emergence of these symbols like the feminine bison that start to prefigure the painted figures on the walls? I want to say a few words about the role of symbol and figuration in this last section. I've suggested that cave art challenges a number of our expectations about art, particularly that certain privileged views of it, the notion of art as a two-dimensional product of a mimetic attempt to copy an object, fail to capture its origin in the Paleolithic world. The broader story that I've suggested is one connected with the imaginative task of replacing or building out something one has only glimpsed, and of doing that within a very three-dimensional material where the relation of surface and depth is always in play. Are there philosophical approaches that can help wrestle with such challenges to our usual expectations? I want to suggest that the opposition between the symbolic and the figurative might be especially important for thinking about art's Paleolithic origins. There are a number of philosophers who have talked about our need for symbol in art. Hegel is one, but the 20th century philosophers Ernst Cassirer and Susanne Langer also come to mind, each of whom opened up the study of the importance of the symbol in new ways across multiple domains, including the scientific, artistic, and religious uses of symbols. This need for symbol may, of course, be connected to all sorts of more immediate human needs, such as the need the early scholars of Paleolithic art saw in rituals associated with successful food hunting. For the philosophers I just mentioned, however, it's a need beyond these. Hegel says, in fact, that art is an absolute need, a need that we can consider as free and in itself, and one that inherently connects to our needs for religion and philosophy. Strikingly, these philosophers also emphasize a duality to the experience of symbol, one side connected to something sensual, and the other possibly going beyond it. In this sense, it would be interesting to tally the very pregnant symbols we've seen in the female bison, in the finger fluting play of the Peshmerga ceiling, to a claim that Cassirer makes about the pregnancy of art, his term, and a broader duality he sees implicit in aesthetic pursuits. Very short quote. Cassirer says, "The beautiful is essentially and necessarily a symbol, because to an extent it is cleft within itself." It's an interesting claim that beauty is cleft within itself. It is always both a unity and double. The internal division of the beautiful between adherence to and transcendence of the sensory not only expresses the tension which pervades the world of our consciousness, but also expresses the original and fundamental polarity of being itself, the dialectic that maintains between the finite and the infinite. If we think about that Peshmerga ceiling, the finger fluting that generates figures, the generativity of Cassirer's claim is very suggestive. One can imagine the almost automatic moves of a hand in the finger fluting, the emerging within it of something that one can now recognize as a symbol, but then how that symbol might open up a wider figurative vocabulary, as I think you can see in that set of fluting. Cassirer lived in the wake of the discovery of Altamira and other early caves, but the language of embodiment and transcendence can be found much earlier. For example, in the great 16th century advocate for art in the age of the Counter-Reformation, Gabriele Paleotti. Paleotti suggested that we view art in terms of a play continually with the experience of absence and presence. For him, in the Counter-Reformation, it was the divine and the holy saints that we especially wanted to think about as being represented by art. It's the task of art, Paleotti thought, to address what he called the defect of distance. David Summers' great global art history makes use of that phrase, the defect of distance. Return to the rhinoceros image for a minute then with me. The experience of a lack on our part that can be felt in the relation between presence and absence, something that can be part of awe, may lead us in different directions that respond in some way to the original challenge to mimesis with which we began. I'm thinking of another Platonic tradition here, in this case among the late Neoplatonists, who came to link the term symbol in a new way with the task of interpreting the enigmatic. In classical Greek, of course, the symbolon was literally a token or talisman that could be broken apart at the time of ratifying a treaty, say, and then used to provide later proof of recognition. When you come back and say, yes, I'm the one who owns that, let's see, fit that symbol together. In late antiquity, however, symbols came to be thought of as interpretable enigmas. And for Neoplatonists like Iamblichus and Proclus, there is a clear counter-approach to mimetic thinking. Iamblichus and Proclus are focused on literary interpretation and divination, not visual art, but the method can be applied. There's a wonderful account of this in a book by Peter Struck on the birth of the symbol. Symbols are not mimetically representational of what is in the world, but they open up a certain sympathy between representations and things, something that I think corresponds interestingly with the experience of pareidolia. There are dangers to reading too much into enigmas, as we all know. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion has talked about the difference between the idol and the icon in visual experience. In the idol, our gaze is frozen as in a mirror. In the icon, he thinks our gaze can be lost as in an infinite depth, drawing it even away from all aesthetics. Which of the two we experience, idol or icon, before an image depends on us, our attitudes. The cave images need be neither idol nor icon, but they certainly give us an experience that is often talked about in terms of aura. We can experience an aura even with the image on a slide or in a replica in a cave, but there is also a particular aura to be found in the experience of the images in original caves. Does it matter, for example, to see the real thing? Well, I still remember the very first real Paleolithic image I ever saw, pressing myself into a crevice to see one of the images in the Las Monedas cave, different somehow for me from the more visually stunning experience of the road in the replica cave at Altamira where all the tourists were hanging out. It's hard not to feel a sense of awe in the presence of an image that has persisted in its place for thousands of years. This feeling of aura, I should say, was not just my experience, but one that the small group of us pressing into that crevice also seemed to feel. And I think the immediacy of that aura also correlates with value. At least that is the argument of the short and lovely book called Things by the contemporary philosopher of art Carolyn Korsmeyer, who had a similar experience in one of the real caves and gives an account of how that feeling may shape our larger value structure. One of the most famous accounts of aura, and one that Korsmeyer draws upon, comes from the critic Walter Benjamin, who thinks about it in terms of a uniqueness of time and space, aura as a uniqueness of time and space, as opposed to the infinitely possible repetition of images we can experience in the modern world as a result of what he called technical reproducibility. Benjamin had in mind especially film and photographic reproduction. Think of the millions of reproductions of Monet haystacks or the Mona Lisa. But his argument has only become stronger with the possibilities of the digital world. There are many virtual images of the Chauvet rhinoceros, but only one unique one in time and place in its crevice. For Benjamin, aura is a matter of historical conditionedness. Since it is lost, he thinks, in an era of modern reproducibility like ours. But I would suggest that the aura of the art of the caves is bound up even more deeply with the recognition of something both present and absent in our experience. The presence of our recognition of the perceptual achievement on the part of the artist, but also our sense of a lack, our sense that something still inevitably escapes us. Escapes us much like that wonderful long rhinoceros horn escapes into that crevice forever, an aura, I think, at once beautiful and sublime, and an opening to us philosophically in the re-questioning of symbolic experience demanded by early art. Thank you very much tonight.